Will Brady hadn't planned on coming back to the suburbs, let alone settling into one of those tastefully symmetrical townhouses where every mailbox matched and each garden bed looked like it was approved by a committee. But here he was, keys in hand, standing at the edge of his new driveway, eyeing the rows of identical two-stories lined along the manicured boulevard with a mix of skepticism and necessity. It wasn't his dream home, but it was a strategic buy. The previous owner had died intestate, and the place had gone into probate limbo. Will, through quiet negotiations and a network of legal contacts, had acquired the property at a fraction of its real value. It was clean, structurally sound, and, best of all, no emotional baggage, just concrete, drywall, and a signature on a deed. Will wasn't the kind of man who made a show of things. He didn't arrive with a moving truck plastered in logos or bring friends to toast on the lawn. He drove a quiet black SUV, made 2 solo trips with the essentials, and unpacked silently over the course of a weekend. Most of the neighbors didn't even notice someone had moved in until the porch light began turning on at night, or a shadow could be seen through the blinds of the second-floor office. He was in his early 50s, trim, clean-cut, with the no-nonsense presence of someone who preferred to avoid drama and made sure things stayed that way. But that peace didn't last long. On the 3rd morning, as Will stepped out to collect the mail, he heard the click of heels on pavement. He turned just in time to see a woman approaching from across the street. Early 60s, maybe older, perfectly coiffed hair lacquered into place, and wearing a lemon-yellow cardigan that practically glowed in the morning sun. Her posture was sharp, calculated, her smile too wide to be casual. She moved with the air of someone accustomed to being acknowledged first. "Good morning," she called out brightly, already halfway up his path before he had the chance to respond. "I don't believe we've met yet." Will gave a polite nod. "Just moved in a few days ago." "Oh, I know," she replied, extending a hand. Her nails were glossy, coral pink, and her grip was firm. "Karen Delbridge. I'm the acting liaison to the neighborhood board. Technically, I'm also the vice president, but I handle most of the day-to-day. My husband was the president until he stepped down recently. Health issues." She paused as if expecting Will to show sympathy, then continued before he could say anything. "So, I've taken over most of the responsibilities, just until we formally re-elect." Will noted the tone, the casual insertion of authority wrapped in pleasantries, but said nothing. She handed him a packet. Printed materials, several pages thick, professionally bound, neighborhood guidelines, lawn maintenance expectations, trash can schedules, color palettes for acceptable exterior paint. Then a handwritten page on top, scrawled in curling script that didn't quite match the corporate neatness beneath. "I made a few notes just for you," she said sweetly. "There's a small issue with the trim color around your windows. It's about 2 shades too cool for the street's aesthetic alignment. And that satellite dish? The board will want it removed. We keep things very uniform around here. It helps with property values." Will didn't flinch. He looked down at the stack of paper and back up at her. "I appreciate the information. I'll review it." Karen tilted her head. "You're not one of those investor types, are you? We had one before. Bought the place on Greenleaf and tried to Airbnb it. Drove everyone crazy. Trash everywhere, people coming and going at all hours. We run a tight ship here, Mr. Brady," he answered. "Will Brady. No, I bought the place for myself." She smiled again, but this time it didn't reach her eyes. "Well, that's good. You'll find things run smoother when everyone plays by the rules." With that, she pivoted and walked away, the sound of her heels receding like a metronome clicking out a warning. Will stood there for a moment, watching her disappear around the hedges. He knew her type. Control, dressed in pastels and smiles, someone who believed rules didn't apply to her because she enforced them. Over the next week, Karen's presence seemed to multiply. Every morning, she walked the block with a clipboard in hand. Will caught glimpses of her peering across his property line, inspecting garden lights, squinting at the length of his grass. On Tuesday, he found a fluorescent pink notice taped to his front door. An initial courtesy violation. Mailbox not up to code. On Wednesday, another. Motion sensor lights too bright for evening ambiance. Thursday, improper storage of recycling bins. Will checked the codes himself. Nothing he'd done technically violated anything, but the tone of the notices suggested she expected compliance, not negotiation. He didn't respond, not at first. He didn't want to give her the satisfaction. But Karen didn't need engagement. She operated on implication and suggestion. Dalkin Will watched her chat with neighbors at the end of the street, saw her gesture toward his home, smile tightly, nod with faux concern. By the second weekend, he noticed some neighbors who had previously waved now looked the other way. It wasn't long before a rumor reached him. A woman named Marlene, who'd lived in the community longer than anyone, pulled him aside while walking her dog. "She told the book club you were squatting here," Marlene whispered, "that you'd moved in without the paperwork being finalized. She says the sale wasn't proper. You should be careful. She's done this before." Will felt something shift then, not fear but an alertness, a cold clarity. He'd dealt with manipulators before, people who ruled with innuendo and paperwork, who didn't need to break the law because they could bend it until it served them. Karen wasn't just some neighbor with too much free time. She was a one-woman institution, and she'd built her kingdom out of compliance and intimidation. He made his first call to his attorney that afternoon. The legal documents for the property were airtight. Will had anticipated potential disputes given the house's probate history. He owned the deed, outright and without contest. But that didn't matter in a neighborhood where perception often carried more weight than facts. Karen wasn't interested in truth. She was interested in authority, and her authority came from fear. Will understood then that silence would be mistaken for weakness, and a single act of resistance would paint him as the threat. Still, he didn't confront her. Not yet. He began documenting everything. Each notice, each interaction. He took photos of his home's condition. He requested written clarification on all complaints. The tone of the letters began to shift from friendly to formal. The smile on Karen's face tightened whenever she passed him. But she didn't stop. Then came the morning when Will received an official-looking envelope in his mailbox, this time not from Karen, but with a local government seal. Inside was a complaint, anonymous but carrying weight, alleging that Will was in violation of multiple housing codes. The list was vague and exaggerated. It read less like a real report and more like a hit list compiled by someone with a vendetta and access to templates. Will sat at his kitchen table that night, staring at the papers, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was targeted, coordinated, and it had just begun. He knew what Karen was doing. She wanted him gone, and if she couldn't do it through rules, she'd do it through isolation, pressure, and harassment masked as regulation. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Will hadn't come here to be part of their system. He'd come to reclaim stability after years of maneuvering chaos in courtrooms, investment meetings, and bureaucratic minefields. He hadn't survived all of that to be pushed out by someone playing dictator in a cardigan. She'd chosen the wrong man to push, and he wasn't going anywhere. The shift came subtly at first, like the pressure drop before a storm, barely noticeable but unsettling. Will had continued about his life with the calm precision he was known for. He rose early, made his coffee, reviewed contracts, answered emails, kept to himself. On the outside, he seemed unfazed by Karen Delbridge's intrusions, by her constant presence and her not-so-subtle campaign to paint him as an outsider. But behind the scenes, he was methodical. Every letter she sent, every conversation that left a strange aftertaste, he cataloged it all, not out of paranoia, but because he understood how quietly a lie could become law if left unchecked. Then came the envelope. It arrived on a Monday morning, sandwiched between utility statements and a local pizza menu. The paper was heavy, the seal embossed. Will opened it at his kitchen island, the coffee in his mug still steaming. At first he assumed it was junk, another community circular or insurance pitch. But the content pulled his attention immediately. A formal letter from a regional real estate regulation office referencing an anonymous complaint submitted against his residency. The language was measured but pointed. According to the letter, there were questions regarding the legitimacy of the ownership transfer on the property Will now called home. It stated that a request had been submitted to pause and review the legitimacy of his claim of residence and that until such a review was complete, a hold could be placed on any renovation, utility alteration, or external work. Will read it 3 times. The complaint didn't come from the complex's board directly, nor was it tied to any known neighbor. But the phrasing was familiar, eerily so. Phrases like inconsistent chain of title and unauthorized access prior to municipal clearance weren't common vocabulary. Yet they mirrored almost exactly what Karen had accused him of in rumor weeks earlier. It was too precise to be coincidence. He immediately contacted his attorney, forwarding the document and requesting a formal response. Within the hour, the lawyer called back, calm but clearly irritated. The complaint had no legal merit. Will's title was fully clear, and the property was purchased through probate court with oversight from both the county and a state registrar. But, his attorney warned, the existence of the complaint could stall permits, trigger temporary holds, and, worst of all, invite more bureaucratic entanglements that would take time to untangle. A frivolous complaint, if worded cleverly, could become a lever. That was Karen's game. She didn't need to win outright. She needed to stall, to inconvenience, to drain him, not financially, not yet, but mentally and emotionally. She was attempting to wear down his resolve, brick by bureaucratic brick. That same afternoon, as if on cue, a service van arrived and parked directly in front of his driveway. Will watched from the upstairs office window as 2 men in polos unloaded what looked like soil testing equipment and walked up to his front yard like they had every right to be there. When he stepped outside to intercept them, the lead technician barely glanced up before announcing they were conducting a scheduled inspection for grounds compliance. When Will asked on whose authority, the man simply replied, "We were sent by the interim neighborhood management coordinator, Ms. Delbridge." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply informed them that if they didn't have a formal order from the county or his signature authorizing access, they were trespassing. The technician hesitated, looked at his partner, then muttered something about checking their paperwork and got back into the van. Within minutes, they were gone. The message, however, remained. That night, Will walked the perimeter of his property with a flashlight in one hand and his phone recording video in the other. It wasn't that he feared sabotage or petty vandalism, although by this point he wouldn't have ruled it out. He was documenting everything, creating a continuous log to send to his lawyer, evidence not just of Karen's interference, but of a campaign, coordinated and targeted, aimed at dislodging him from within. 2 days later, a warning appeared on his utility account. Pending verification of residency, it said in red letters, right next to a note about delayed authorization for a recent service change. Will had requested upgraded internet installation, fiber optics to support his work infrastructure. Suddenly, that order was under review. When he called the provider, the customer service agent apologized and told him there was an open dispute linked to his address, flagged by the neighborhood administrator. He paused. Neighborhood administrator? Yes, sir, that's what the system shows. We received notice through the HOA liaison contact portal. Someone submitted a concern regarding rightful occupancy status. Until it's resolved, our work order can't proceed. Will thanked the agent and hung up. Then he sat at his desk, took a breath, and began drafting a letter, not to Karen and not to the service provider, but to the state-level Consumer Protection Agency. His complaint outlined a clear, escalating pattern of obstruction rooted in fraud and misrepresentation. He attached every letter, every time-stamped photo, every witness name he'd collected over the past 3 weeks. Then he submitted it, along with a second copy to the county recorder's office. He was done playing defense. Karen's boldness escalated in tandem. The next morning, a new notice appeared on his door, this one thicker than the rest. It bore an official header with Karen's name signed in cursive at the bottom. Temporary cease and desist. Residential alteration violation. The letter alleged that Will had installed an unauthorized security camera without submitting plans for visual approval, a violation of communal aesthetic standards. It demanded immediate removal, or a $750 fine would be levied. Will smiled for the first time in days. The camera in question? It wasn't new. It had been installed by the previous owner, and he had the dated invoice to prove it. What's more, it wasn't visible from the street. He contacted the property management office, not the internal board, but the actual municipal department overseeing neighborhood compliance, and provided the documentation. Hours later, a senior inspector called and personally apologized for the inconvenience. There was no violation. The complaint would be logged as baseless. Will thanked him, hung up, and updated his growing case file. But that wasn't the real victory. That afternoon, while watering the modest bed of shrubs in front of the house, Will spotted Karen watching him from across the street. She stood by her mailbox, arms crossed, lips pressed into a pale line. For a moment, their eyes met. Will didn't wave. He didn't nod. He simply turned, picked up the hose, and finished watering. Not a word was exchanged. But something changed in that silence. Karen had seen that her pressure wasn't working, not in the way she expected. Instead of retreating or overreacting, Will was digging in, anchoring himself. And, perhaps, for the first time, she realized he wasn't going to be another easy removal. That realization didn't slow her down. In fact, it made her reckless. That weekend, at the neighborhood's informal Saturday brunch, a long-standing tradition hosted by a rotating roster of families, Karen made her move. She brought a stack of papers, made a short speech about community integrity, and began handing out what she called a petition to revisit residency qualifications for at-risk addresses. She didn't say Will's name, but her gaze wandered to his. House every few minutes, and the implication was clear. Marlene told him later that afternoon. She didn't sign, but several did. Some out of fear, others because they didn't want to be labeled as indifferent. The paper was nonsense, legally meaningless. But it wasn't about legality. It was about perception, and how many people Karen could sway to her narrative. Will knew what this was now. She was no longer probing for weakness. She was trying to take control of the narrative, to cast him as an intruder, a risk, a disruption to their well-maintained illusion of unity. And now she was escalating toward something dangerous, where reputations were damaged, and where the wrong step could mean a loss not of property, but of peace, identity, and safety. What Karen didn't realize was that Will had seen far worse tactics in boardrooms, in courthouses, and in mediated asset battles where tens of millions were on the line. He wasn't afraid of her, but he was aware now of the stakes, and he would not lose. The following week, the hostility took form, not in the dramatic, theatrical ways Will had once expected from people like Karen, but in subtler, more insidious patterns that hinted at a long-practiced, deeply internalized kind of neighborhood warfare. It started with the trash collection, a detail most homeowners wouldn't think twice about unless it didn't happen. Will had placed his bins at the curb the night before, as usual, each one closed properly, labels facing outward in accordance with the community's guideline sheet Karen herself had handed him weeks earlier. But by midday, his bins were still untouched, even as every other house on the street had been serviced and cleared. They remained there into the late afternoon, conspicuous and isolated, as if marked. At first, he assumed it was a mistake. He called the sanitation provider directly, and after 20 minutes of being shuffled between representatives, one finally offered a clipped explanation. A complaint had been submitted through the resident portal indicating improper sorting and contaminated recycling content. It triggered an auto hold on his address pending re-inspection. Will asked if the complaint included photographic evidence or even a timestamp. The representative hesitated before admitting it did not. It was filed as a priority neighbor alert, a rarely used function typically reserved for biohazard or repeat offenses. The policy had a loophole. If someone with administrative status marked it as urgent, it bypassed initial review. Will knew immediately who had filed it. He didn't argue. He requested a written copy of the complaint, asked for the supervisor's name, then hung up. The garbage stayed where it was another 2 days, during which neighbors passed his home with brief glances, some sympathetic, others clearly enjoying the small scandal. Then came the gate. Will's home had a private access code to the community's rear vehicular entry, which he used for more convenient parking during the evenings when the main boulevard grew congested. On Thursday, that code stopped working. No alert, no prior notice, just a red flashing error and a buzzing lockout. He was forced to circle back and park in the guest lot a quarter-mile from his property. Again, he reached out, this time to the neighborhood system administrator, and learned his code had been temporarily disabled due to flagged credentials. The phrasing was intentionally vague. The person on the other end of the line sounded nervous, as if unsure of how to justify it, finally conceding that someone had submitted a security concern, and the system responded with an automatic suspension until validation was completed. There was no validation needed. Will's credentials were clean. His name was on the ownership record, his ID was current, and he had never missed a single payment on dues, even though he now questioned why he was paying into a system that allowed for such targeted manipulation. When he demanded documentation of the concern, he was told it had been submitted verbally at a board meeting by the interim neighborhood liaison, Karen Delbridge. It wasn't just tactics anymore. This was campaign-level interference. Karen had found the weak points in the community's administrative layers, entry codes, waste management, service tickets, and was using them like weapons, not because she believed Will had broken any rules, but because she believed he hadn't yet, submitted to her authority. Every incident was a reminder. In her world, those who didn't yield would be bled out, one convenience at a time. Still, Will didn't react publicly. That was her terrain. Loud confrontations, scenes on porches, power plays at brunch tables. He preferred process. After gathering the complaints, the service statements, the access lockout logs, he sat down with his attorney and outlined a plan. They filed a cease and desist letter citing harassment through misuse of community infrastructure, and they submitted copies to both the board and the local residential oversight committee. Will didn't expect an immediate result, but he wasn't playing for temporary wins. He wanted documentation. He wanted a trail. Karen responded with theater. At the next community gathering, a monthly open-lawn social hosted near the main entrance fountain, she arrived earlier than everyone else, set up a small folding table and stacked it with printed pamphlets titled Preserving Community Harmony. Her hair was immaculately styled and she wore a pastel blue dress with embroidered trim, the image of suburban elegance. She smiled at everyone, offered lemonade, and gestured subtly toward Will's house as she spoke to new attendees. Will, who had arrived quietly, kept to the periphery, watching. It was clear she wasn't naming him outright. She didn't have to. Her language was coded but precise. We've had disruptions. A resident who misunderstood the ethos of our space, someone who's choosing litigation over conversation. People nodded, uncomfortable but silent. Later that week, Will noticed something off. The smart home app connected to his property's security system showed a brief outage, 38 minutes just before midnight. Nothing had triggered his alarms, but the footage cut out and resumed as if nothing had happened, When he checked the video manually, the file for that period was missing. Not corrupted. Gone. He contacted the system provider, who confirmed no technical errors on their end, and suggested he reset his encryption key, which he did immediately. He didn't tell anyone. He just waited. 2 nights later, movement flickered across the motion lights on his driveway. Will stepped outside, phone in one hand, flashlight in the other. No one was there. But in the morning, his mailbox was dented inward, deliberately, carefully, not smashed by kids or random vandalism, but creased as if pressed with controlled force. No note, no signature. That Saturday, as if to crown the escalation, Karen appeared on his property in broad daylight. Will was pruning a hedge along the front path, earbuds in, when he sensed her presence. She stood 5 feet from him, arms crossed, mouth tight. When he removed the earbuds, she spoke. "You think you can bully your way through this neighborhood? That we don't talk to each other? That we don't protect our peace?" Will straightened. He didn't speak. She stepped closer, violating personal space in a way that would have startled anyone else. Her voice was low now, venomous. "You're not the first man who thought he could out-logic me. But they all left, one by one. They leave because this place doesn't belong to people like you." Then, without warning, she slapped him. Open palm, full force across the side of the face. The sound cracked like a whip across the quiet street. A neighbor across the road dropped their gardening trowel. Another paused with a watering can frozen mid-pour. Will didn't move. He didn't raise a hand. He just turned his head slowly, eyes burning with the kind of control that unsettled more than any outburst ever could. Karen's hand shook slightly as she lowered it. For a moment, she looked unsure. Then she stepped back, as if realizing too late what she'd just done. Will pulled out his phone, dialed a number, and spoke 4 words. "I need an officer." Then he turned, walked inside his house, and closed the door behind him. What followed wasn't rage. It was colder than that. Measured, surgical. The police arrived 12 minutes later. Will met them calmly, handed over written documentation, dates, photos, and described the incident in a flat, clear voice. He declined to press criminal charges on the spot but filed a full report. The officers took his statement, reviewed the footage from his external cam, and told him they'd file it officially. Karen, by that point, had retreated to her home, curtains drawn, door locked. But the damage was done. Not to Will, to her. Neighbors talked. Quietly at first, in driveways, over hedges. The blow had changed something. Karen, who had always ruled through perception, now had an image she couldn't walk back. Violent, unprovoked, and unraveling. Will didn't feed the narrative. He never mentioned it again in public, but his resolve changed. The lines were now drawn. This wasn't a dispute, it was a siege, and she had just fired the first open shot. The days that followed the assault unfolded with an eerie sense of restraint, as if the entire neighborhood had agreed, silently and collectively, to enter a phase of calculated observation. Karen's outburst had landed like a crack in polished glass. Too dramatic to ignore, too inconvenient to openly confront. She disappeared from the social stage almost immediately. No walks with clipboards, no sudden pop-ins to discuss shrub heights or porch lighting schemes. Her house remained closed, the curtains tightly drawn, the porch untouched. But absence wasn't surrender, and Will knew better than to assume she was done. He had seen people like her before, those whose power thrived not in confrontation, but in the ability to recover, reframe, and re-emerge as the victim, with just enough ambiguity to split public opinion and muddy the truth. Will, meanwhile, kept his focus not on Karen herself, but on the framework she had manipulated. It wasn't her personal venom that made her dangerous, but her intimate understanding of how to weaponize the rules of a community, how to insert herself into procedural gaps and use the illusion of authority to punish without ever lifting a finger. She had turned the neighborhood into a board game, and Will had finally stopped pretending it was just about real estate. It was about power, and now, with a filed police report and mounting evidence of procedural abuse, he was ready to take back control, not just of his property, but of the narrative. With the help of his attorney, Will arranged a formal hearing through the Residential Oversight Division. It was a real mechanism, rarely used, designed to mediate disputes between private homeowners and neighborhood associations, or, in this case, individuals claiming to speak for them. The filing included not only Karen's pattern of harassment, but her impersonation of board authority, her submission of falsified complaints, and, of course, the physical assault. It was a calculated move. Not a lawsuit, not a media stunt, but an institutional step that put her under review. It meant records would be demanded, timelines examined, and voices brought into the light that previously whispered only behind closed doors. News of the hearing spread faster than Will expected. Marlene, who had quietly supported him from the beginning, confided that a handful of neighbors had already begun asking questions about Karen's role. Not everyone was brave enough to speak up, but the silence was breaking. Some were discovering, perhaps for the first time, that Karen hadn't been officially involved in anything for over 2 years. Her title as liaison was never approved, her decisions never recorded, and her supposed authority to file neighborhood actions entirely self-appointed. What had kept her in power was a perception. Layers of soft bullying and social engineering, and Will had torn through that illusion with a single police report. Then came the letter, folded neatly and slid under his front door one early morning. It bore no name, but the handwriting was feminine and sharp. Inside, on a single sheet of heavy stationery, were the words, "Be careful where you push. Some people don't break. They pull." There was no signature, no threat explicit enough to involve law enforcement, but the meaning was clear. Karen wasn't hiding. She was regrouping. Will didn't react outwardly. He scanned the paper for fingerprints, placed it in a sealed envelope, and logged the time and date. Then, without announcement, he installed 2 additional cameras. One focused on the door, the other on the driveway. He wasn't afraid, not in the way Karen wanted. He was prepared. And preparation, in his world, always beat posturing. The hearing date was set for the following Tuesday. In the days leading up to it, Karen began her reinvention campaign. Not on his property, not through threats, but through silence, charm, and narrative control. She began walking again, slower now, greeting people with exaggerated warmth. She dropped by homes with banana bread, offered to help fix a growing concern about a possible rise in crime, and even volunteered to coordinate a new community newsletter. Her timing was flawless. She was attempting to re-enter the public conversation not as an aggressor, but as the friendly widow, the misunderstood matriarch trying to do what's best for everyone. Will saw through it, but more importantly, so did others. On the morning of the hearing, the small room at the District Civic Center was surprisingly full. A few board members were present. A legal observer from the Oversight Division sat with a notepad, and nearly a dozen neighbors attended, some out of loyalty, others out of curiosity. Karen arrived last, dressed in beige slacks and a modest blouse, clutching a leather portfolio and radiating wounded grace. She sat with a calm face, hands folded, as if the events of the past month had been a misunderstanding best clarified with kindness and logic. Will didn't address her directly. When asked to present his statement, he did so cleanly, calmly, laying out dates, documents, recordings, and letters. He didn't embellish. He didn't speculate. He presented facts: the falsified complaints, the impersonation of authority, the documented harassment, and the physical assault corroborated by neighbors. When he finished, he didn't turn to gauge the room's reaction. He knew silence in that moment was louder than any applause. Karen's response was predictable. She began with an apology, not for her actions, but for how things may have appeared. She spoke about stress, the burden of community management, and how difficult it can be for single women trying to uphold standards in increasingly aggressive times. She implied that Will had misunderstood her role, misinterpreted her actions, and escalated situations that could have been resolved with a simple conversation. She dismissed the complaint about the slap as emotion running too high, something that wasn't who she really was. But something shifted as she spoke. A few people in the audience exchanged glances. A board member scribbled something in the margins of his papers. The civic observer raised her eyebrows ever so slightly. Karen was performing, but for the first time her script felt tired, too practiced, and her attempt to blend vulnerability with authority felt mismatched in a room full of documents and dates. When the hearing concluded, no ruling was issued immediately. The Oversight Committee would review materials, consult with legal, and issue findings within the week. But the energy had changed. Karen left quickly without speaking to anyone. Will remained a moment longer, thanking the committee and walking out into the parking lot as the sun dipped behind the trees. It wasn't over, but it had turned. The middle point in any war, Will knew, wasn't the bloodiest. It was the quietest. It was when both sides realized the other wasn't leaving. It was when illusions stopped working, and the next move had to be real. And now Karen had no more illusions left to play. She would come back harder. But so would he. The silence that followed the hearing was deceptive, stretched over the neighborhood like a taut wire, elegantly still but vibrating with pressure. No immediate fallout came from the Civic Committee. No declarations or visible shifts in authority. But Will felt it all tightening around him. Subtle but suffocating. Karen had left the hearing diminished, not defeated, and he knew enough about people like her to understand that she wouldn't waste time licking her wounds. She would retreat only to strategize, to reframe the narrative not through direct confrontation, but through systems, structures, and proxies. She had already proven she understood how to bypass the need for legitimacy by occupying the spaces where authority usually lives. Now that her personal credibility had taken a hit, she would no longer lead the charge herself. She would delegate the war. It began with the petition, a fresh one, printed, formatted like official neighborhood material, but lacking any seal or board endorsement. The heading read, Community Oversight and Resident Harmony Initiative. The language was calm, calculated, and full of vague appeals to order, ensuring safety, maintaining quality of life, and addressing the destabilizing influence of confrontational occupants. No names were mentioned, but there was no question whom it targeted. The document framed its intentions not as punishment, but as proactive engagement, to encourage community-aligned behavior. It was left in mailboxes, slipped under doors, and pinned discreetly near the community notice board. Will didn't touch his copy. He photographed it, scanned the QR code that led to a nondescript online form, and watched as signatures began appearing, some clearly coerced, others likely from residents too disconnected to understand the stakes. The digital page allowed for anonymous support, further diluting accountability. What disturbed him most wasn't the petition itself, but the speed with which it spread and the subtle return of deference toward Karen. She was no longer out front, but her hand was unmistakable behind the curtain. Then the rules changed, quietly, unofficially. Will discovered one morning that his regular parking spot was painted over with fresh white lines, now designated temporary maintenance access. No notice, no email, no alternative space offered. He called the property administrator, only to be told the change had been verbally approved by a liaison member after an internal discussion on traffic safety. When he asked for the meeting minutes, they didn't exist. When he requested a record of the motion, it was not documented but understood by consensus. It was bureaucratic vapor, hard to grab, impossible to disprove. The following week, 2 more service requests he had submitted, one for an irrigation adjustment, another for storm drain maintenance, were marked as rejected due to pending residential behavior review. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was systemic interference, a soft quarantine of his rights within the very structure he was funding. Karen had weaponized the board from the inside out, turning mechanisms meant for fairness into tools of control. She had converted the system into a buffer, a way to punish him while shielding herself from liability. Still, Will didn't act emotionally. He doubled down on record-keeping. He had his attorney request copies of any internal policy changes. He escalated his case to the Regional Housing Committee and submitted formal ethics complaints against 3 board members known to be within Karen's circle. He installed a secure mailbox and had all packages redirected to a P.O. box in the neighboring district. Every move she made he mirrored with precision, not to outfight her but to outlast her. But then she escalated again, this time through noise. It began with a renovation next door. The house, previously occupied by a quiet older couple, had gone on the market and sold in less than 3 days. The new owner never introduced themselves. What arrived instead was a stream of contractors, loud equipment, and late-night activity. Dumpsters parked halfway into Will's access, workers shouting at 6 a.m., spotlights shining into his windows after dark. He contacted the municipality and found no permits on file, yet every attempt to halt the activity hit a wall. Karen, it turned out, had designated the house as community-sanctioned renewal, under a temporary beautification order, a clause buried in a subcommittee proposal from 3 years earlier that granted provisional freedom to projects deemed visually restorative. It was a trap. The chaos was designed to provoke a response, to draw Will into a shouting match, to make him appear unstable. But he refused to play that role. Instead, he recorded noise levels, documented violations, and requested formal inspection. The process was slow, painfully so, but Will knew timing wasn't his enemy. Impulse was. Karen wanted him angry. She wanted him reckless. He stayed deliberate until the break-in. It happened on a Wednesday night, after a stretch of relative calm. No broken windows, no alarms tripped. But inside his garage on the far wall near the water heater was a set of deep gouges in the drywall. Deliberate, precise, like someone had driven a tool into the surface over and over. Nothing was stolen. Nothing else was touched. The camera covering that section had mysteriously gone dark for exactly 24 minutes, then resumed. No sign of forced entry at any exterior point. It was surgical. A message, not a crime. Will didn't call the police, not because he was afraid, but because he knew the result would be another report, another inconclusive investigation filed away as unresolved. Instead, he called his private security contact and he had a silent perimeter alert system installed. 1. That didn't notify the authorities, but notified him, instantly, to any unauthorized motion within 5 feet of his property's interior boundary. He also upgraded his camera system, added off-site backups, and began having daily activity logs forwarded to both his lawyer and his insurer. But the worst came not from outside, but from within his own wall of allies. Marlene, his most vocal supporter, approached him one evening, visibly shaken. She had received a letter, anonymous and typed, warning her to cease alignment with destabilizing elements, or risk being included in upcoming evaluations. It was vague, almost ridiculous in its language, but it rattled her enough to pull away. She stopped waving when they crossed paths. She didn't come by with updates. Will didn't blame her. Fear works, and Karen had built her kingdom on it. The week after, a formal complaint was lodged accusing Will of emotional aggression toward elderly neighbors. The board voted, unofficially and without quorum, to place a moratorium on any service requests or correspondence from him until the complaint was resolved internally. It was a clear violation of his rights as a homeowner, but it also laid bare the truth. Karen didn't need a majority. She only needed to install enough chaos that others would step back from the mess. Will responded not with fire, but with light. He scheduled a community meeting, off-site in a neutral public space, and invited every resident by name, not to defend himself, not to attack Karen, but to explain the structural failure occurring within their own governance. He brought documents, timelines, video clips, and legal notices, not as spectacle, but as reality. Only 19 people showed up. But that was more than enough. What they saw wasn't just a neighbor being bullied. They saw a system in collapse, a neighborhood where someone could masquerade as authority, punish dissent, and destabilize property value while pretending to protect it. Will didn't ask for votes or support. He asked for accountability. He left that room having done the one thing Karen had feared most, recontextualizing the battle. No longer Will versus Karen. Now it was the residents versus manipulation itself. And that, he knew, was the beginning of the end. Not of the fight, but of her illusion of control. Because once people saw the strings, the puppet show couldn't go on. The unraveling didn't happen all at once. It came in pulses, like the slow unfurling of a tightly wound spring, each rotation releasing tension that had quietly built for weeks. Will had learned to track the signs not through words but through gestures, glances, shifts in posture during driveway conversations. Karen was still present, still dressed in her carefully curated layers of politeness and concern, but the temperature around her had changed. Neighbors began answering her less enthusiastically, stepping back from her with guarded smiles, and some, perhaps emboldened by the off-site meeting Will had hosted, started asking quiet questions, not to him, but to each other. What exactly did Karen do? When was she last officially part of anything? Had anyone ever actually seen minutes from the meetings she claimed to hold? It didn't matter that the answers had been available all along. What mattered was that people had finally begun looking for themselves. The moment people stopped accepting her authority as fact, it began to crumble. Karen, sensing the shift, pushed harder. The following week, she submitted a residential disturbance report to the board, again targeting Will. But this time she included a witness signature from a man no one in the neighborhood recognized. When one of the board members, a quiet but diligent woman named Sonia, asked to speak with the witness herself, the address listed turned out to be vacant. It was a misstep, small but fatal, because Sonia wasn't the type to let it slide. She dug deeper, and within days she'd uncovered not only the falsified report, but a pattern of misrepresented communications Karen had submitted over the past year, several of which were now provably fraudulent. Sonia didn't confront Karen directly. Instead, she compiled everything into a packet and forwarded it to the Regional Oversight Board, copying Will's attorney on the submission. At the same time, the outcome of Will's original harassment hearing finally arrived, a formal decision signed and sealed. Karen Delbridge was found to have impersonated official roles, obstructed services to a homeowner, and violated ethical standards of residential conduct. The report didn't carry criminal weight, but it was damning in its language, and it gave Will exactly what he needed, an institutional document confirming what he had long known. With it in hand, he filed a motion to trigger a vote of no confidence against the remaining members of the board who had either enabled Karen or failed to act against her repeated violations. Karen's response was pure performance. She didn't deny the charges. She deflected. She called for an emergency town hall, not to defend herself but to claim victimhood. She spoke at length about hostile environments, misogyny in enforcement language, and how her commitment to order and safety had been twisted by a smear campaign. She cried publicly for the first time, her voice cracking as she described feeling unsafe in her own community. And for a few moments, it almost worked. A handful of residents, sympathetic to emotion, paused. But then Will stepped forward, and instead of responding with his own accusations, he read directly from the oversight report, line by line, calmly, without embellishment. There was no theater in his voice, only gravity. And as he spoke, the room shifted again. not toward sympathy, but toward reckoning. The vote came 2 days later. In a community not known for turnout or activism, nearly every eligible resident showed up. The process was slow, methodical, ballots collected in silence. When the final count was posted, the result was overwhelming. Karen was barred from holding any role, formal or advisory, within the neighborhood's governance structure, effective immediately. 2 board members stepped down voluntarily. Sonia, along with 3 newly elected residents, took interim control with a mandate to audit all decisions made in the past 2 years. For the first time in a long time, the machinery that had been operating in shadow began moving in daylight. Karen didn't speak publicly again after the vote. Her house remained shuttered. Rumors swirled that she had lawyered up, that she was preparing a defamation suit, that she'd been offered a quiet relocation package by a property group invested in maintaining the area's image. But Will didn't engage. He didn't speculate. He had never been after a spectacle. He had wanted peace, fairness, stability, the right to live in his own home without being undermined by someone playing queen on a throne she built herself. But the final confrontation didn't come in a courtroom or a meeting hall. It came quietly, one gray morning, when Will found Karen standing at the edge of his driveway. She wasn't dressed for battle. She wore a pale sweater, jeans, her hair undone for the first time since he'd met her. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a manila envelope. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice hoarse. "This place isn't what I thought it was anymore." Will said nothing. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," she continued. "I really thought I was helping, making it better." He looked at her for a long time, not with anger, but with the clear, unwavering gaze of someone who no longer owed her anything. She held out the envelope. "These are copies of everything I ever filed. Some of it probably won't help you now, but I thought you should have it." He took the envelope, nodded once, and stepped back inside his house. He didn't look at her as she turned and walked away. Inside, the kitchen light buzzed faintly. Outside, a truck engine started. The storm had passed, not in fury, but in clarity. And for the first time in months, Will stood in his home and felt like its owner, not just on paper, but in truth. The weeks after Karen's departure brought a stillness to the neighborhood that felt at first unnatural, like a theater after the curtain had fallen. The seats still warm from the presence of an audience, but eerily quiet without their voices. For the first time since Will had moved in, there were no anonymous letters, no sudden citations, no clipboard inspections veiled as friendly chats. The garden that had once been scrutinized for its shade of mulch was now just a garden. The lights on his porch, once marked as too bright for neighborhood ambiance, now illuminated the evenings without comment. And perhaps most telling of all, people had started to talk to him, not in hushed tones or sidelong glances, but in full conversation, on sidewalks, at mailbox clusters, with a cautious warmth that hinted at both relief and regret. Relief that the oppressive order had lifted, and regret that it had taken someone standing up alone for others to open their eyes. The new board, headed temporarily by Sonia and 2 other volunteers, moved quickly to establish legitimacy and transparency. They launched a full audit of the association's recent activity, uncovered misuse of funds in 2 minor accounts, and created an open-access log of all complaints and maintenance requests moving forward. Will was asked to serve as an advisor during the transition period, not out of obligation, but because his precision, composure, and commitment had become a quiet benchmark. He accepted with conditions that meetings be recorded, decisions documented publicly, and all board members undergo yearly reapproval by a vote, not procedural, but meaningful. There was no celebration, no champagne or speeches, just the slow rebuilding of trust through accountability, one policy at a time. Karen's house sat empty for a month before it was listed discreetly. The sale went through quickly, off-market, to a young couple who, when they moved in, brought with them 2 small children, a golden retriever, and a complete lack of interest in anything that wasn't their own business. Will introduced himself once, offered a welcome, and left it at that. He had no desire to mark the house with history, and they had no questions about it. The past didn't need to haunt them. It had already left enough echoes. One afternoon, as Will sipped his coffee on the porch, the breeze carried the distant sound of kids playing, laughter bouncing off stucco and brick, mingling with the rhythmic tap of a basketball on pavement. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that this was what he'd wanted all along. Not control, not victory, but the freedom to live quietly, without interference, in a space that belonged to him not just legally, but entirely. There was a dignity in that, a kind of peace that couldn't be bought or signed into existence. It had to be claimed, defended, and ultimately earned. Marlene returned too, slowly, her greetings growing less stiff, her conversations gradually returning to form. One day she brought him a plate of banana bread, just like she had that first week, and lingered long enough to talk about the jasmine she planned to replant by her window. No apologies were exchanged. None were needed. The neighborhood had suffered a long, quiet fever, and the healing wasn't in explanations. It was in the simple act of moving forward. The envelope Karen had given him remained unopened on his desk for a long time, not out of fear or suspense, but because Will had already decided he didn't need it. The war was over. Knowing how it was fought behind the curtain wouldn't change that. But one evening, out of quiet curiosity, he slid it open and flipped through the contents. Typed complaints, handwritten notes, lists of residents, and coded annotations that read more like performance cues than governance. She had choreographed everything, every escalation, every silence, every piece of social theater designed to create the illusion of order while pulling strings behind the scenes. In a strange way, it was brilliant. And in a sadder way, it was hollow. He sealed the documents again and tucked them into a file cabinet behind the deed to his house, where they would stay. Not as weapons, not as trophies, but as a reminder. That power, when left unchecked, always comes disguised at first. That control, when mistaken for leadership, can poison the very community it claims to protect. And that sometimes all it takes to expose the illusion is one person who refuses to look away. Will never spoke Karen's name again, not because it haunted him, but because it no longer had weight. She had come, ruled, and fallen, not with flames, but with silence. Her departure wasn't revenge, it was restoration, and in that restoration, Will had found not just his footing in the neighborhood, but something deeper, ownership of himself, in a place where so many had given theirs away. As spring came in full bloom and the days stretched longer, neighbors once cautious began to wave first. Some stopped to chat. Others simply nodded in passing, no longer uncertain of where they stood or who might be watching. The street became a street again. The homes became homes again. And Will, sitting on the porch with sunlight on his shoulders, the wind clean and quiet, finally belonged.